Hearthstone allegedly used to have a randomness problem, but it's far from the only card game that had a complex relationship with randomness and random effects specifically. I'd wager a guess that for any card game that has the word random appear on one of its cards, you'll find contentious discussion on whether that's a good idea. I'm Simon from Games Deconstructed, and this is the random effect video. For an initial observation, we can agree that A, most card games feature at least some form of randomness, usually at least in card draw being randomized. That's mostly to place a little less weight on pure calculation and memorizing specific linear lines of play, two skills that are still involved in card games to a degree, but less so than in chess, for example. Part of that skill budget instead goes to flexibility, being able to react to novel situations caused by the random elements. It's a similar rationale to why card games often feature hidden information, while chess does not. That's another design choice that lessens the impact of pure calculation, while making other skills more prominent. In this case, meta-knowledge, you'll know what the opponent may have in hand if you know their deck, or player psychology, you'll know what the opponent may have in hand based on previous decisions they have taken. And there's also element B, there are forms of randomness that are better than others. We could really get into the weeds here, really dismantle what better means in this context, but let's assume that I mean less irritating for the player base and conducive to playing the game in a fun way, ideally for all players. Now, bad randomness often bears a higher effect on the game state than player decision, that's kind of a hallmark. If you've been making right calls all game, but the end result comes down to essentially rolling a die, that's bad randomness more often than not. A litmus test for this one is to see if randomness is localized within a single instance of an effect that has the potential to be game-ending. Because if the game ends, there is very little chance you will get to react to the outcome and showcase player skill. Another trend that seems to emerge is that random effects often seem to have one specific positive outcome. In the case visible on screen right now, if Ragnaros decides to put his 8 damage towards my opponent's face, I will win the game, with the next one in line being substantially worse. If Ragnaros decides to do anything else, I will lose the game. Players will often find themselves playing into these lines, even if it's not optimal, because A, they are easy to see, and B, they remove some responsibility for the outcome from the player's shoulders. In this example, I might have effectively lost the game through my own decisions a couple of turns ago, but if I lose now as a result of Ragnaros hitting the wrong target, that's not really my fault, is it? That observation of there only being one good outcome can of course be objectively true, like in the example we just discussed, or alternatively, it can be a result of optimization-focused perception on the player's part, where it's easy to see a positive but suboptimal result as absolute trash, essentially, especially when a game places a high emphasis on mistake avoidance in player decision-making. If you spend most of the game attempting not to break yourself, kind of getting out of the way of your own deck, if RNG decides to cut itself some slack and give you maybe the third best outcome, it's hard to accept that with grace. If I expect perfection from myself, it's hard to accept anything other than perfection from random effects. Now, one idea that I find useful in differentiating between good and bad in more nuanced examples than these is output versus input randomness. I've happened upon that concept reading Keith Bergen's writing, which you can find in the sources list in the top comment, more on that at the end of the video, and to my knowledge, Keith has either coined or at least substantially popularized this concept. So input randomness is when something random happens, you are presented with the result, and have to react accordingly. Your opening hand in a card game, the first location revealed in Marvel Snap, which cards are part of the kingdom in Dominion. Those are all random effects that you're presented with and you have to craft your strategy around. While output randomness is when you've made a decision that cannot be undone, there has been costs paid, there have been information revealed, cards played, and the outcome of the random effect is only presented afterwards. So it's kind of like randomness reacts to your decision instead of the other way around, like with input randomness. But this might get you thinking, it sure got me thinking, that output randomness kind of seems like it could become input randomness for the future, right? If I play the Shadowverse card King's Welcome, I either get or don't get the commander from my deck that I'd like, I will just adjust my strategy for the future. Output randomness will become input randomness. Now, Keith Bergen considers that idea of output randomness transforming into input randomness for the next turn, as he puts it, to be a bad application of this theory, but I disagree. I think we can look at these mini loops of a random effect being played, resulting in its random output, and the results of that output allowing the player to react again, essentially, incorporating that into a new strategy. I attack with Torkoal's Concentrated Fire, I flip a number of coins. The attack doesn't deal enough damage to kill my opponent, so I have to re-establish my strategy for the next turn, which in this case was to lose the game, as putting all the flip a coin cards you have is not a recipe for a good Pokemon deck. But there was a moment between the random occurrence being a random output of what I just did, and it being random input for my next turn. And that moment is where the emotions associated with randomness live. That's where I could have gotten angry, or overjoyed, or mentally reminded myself to stay calm while engaging in a bit of Wim Hof breathing, depending on the result, of course. I think Keith is against viewing this input-output relationship as cyclical because it places a great deal of importance on that single, short moment of transformation. And the existence and our awareness of that moment doesn't exactly lead to us being able to design better games. One observation that I've made is that you can play with the player psychology happening in that moment by the use of gameplay elements outside of it. It can be influenced by preceding or following gameplay that doesn't even have to appear directly next to it chronologically. Balatro is a game that has been gaining insane, may I say Slay the Spyrian levels of popularity recently. It's a gambling-themed, abstract, roguelike card game with a huge amount of random chance involved. It's a game where your run may prove unsalvageable because you spec'd heavily into Diamond Suit cards and the game decided to give you a boss that turns off all of them. Definitely a hypothetical scenario that didn't happen to me multiple times. Balatro has many elements associated with gambling and randomness. There is the use of a standard 52 card deck, a popular gambling implement. Jokers, which are the game's upgrades, feature very prominently. Booster packs are the main form of card acquisition. There's even slot machine reminiscent sound design in some parts. It all builds an expectation of the game being highly random, and these elements get the player used to that randomness via association. You will build your strategy around a random hand of cards, you will bolster your deck with the contents of random shops, you will face a random selection of blinds in an ante, that's what Balatro calls enemies in a level, mind the use of the poker terms. But apart from these input random elements, it also has a number of strict output randomness. Effects with a percentage chance of firing, cards that have a percentage chance to destroy themselves every time you use them, etc. As a game about gambling, bearing the stylistic elements associated with gambling, it incentivizes you to chase that high roll payout, both through its mechanics and aesthetics. And if that doesn't pan out, if you don't end up winning, how can you be mad at the slot machine game? It showed you its cards, haha, early and openly. One implementation of output randomness that I quite enjoy is Discover-style mechanics. It's called Discover in Hearthstone, where it allows you to choose one of random 3 cards from a pool that's mentioned in the effect. Like with Discover a Beast, you'd get shown 3 beasts and have to choose one. There are examples in different games. A similar mechanic is called Create in Gwent. There is the digital-only mechanic Draft in MTG Arena's Alchemy format as well. Generally, this sort of mechanic works best in digital CCGs, as the computer handles the contents of the pools that you draw the cards from. If you wanted to discover a random beast in paper play, I think you would have to have a list or something? Discover-style mechanics are, in my opinion, a decent example of randomness because they very quickly transition from output randomness to input randomness. Sure, you've paid the cost for Messenger Raven, and you might see good or bad results, that's output randomness. But because you get to choose the least bad or best out of the three, it very quickly becomes about how you react to being given a random selection of cards rather than the selection of cards themselves, so it becomes input randomness. It minimizes the length of that moment of emotional reaction, that moment of transformation from one to the other. And as that emotional reaction is often negative, I think that's a good call. There is also profound psychological value in making the player choose, because even if the card is not the key to victory, its existence on the field being a result of player decision instantly makes it valuable. Being able to choose can salvage the perception of being given 3 bad cards because you get to choose the least worst one, or sweeten the deal when you're being given 3 good ones because hey, you get to choose the best one. Giving 3 cards instead of 1 also helps with smoothing the averages out a bit. It's less swingy in the same way rolling 3 dice is less swingy than just rolling a single die. With 1d6, you're exactly as likely to get the best or worst result, while with 3d6, you're more likely to see the middle values. Same with being shown 1 card versus 3 cards. There's also another balance lever and perhaps form of skill expression involved in making the discover mechanic use different card pools. You know, discovering a beast versus discovering a hunter card versus discovering a spell, for example. As a balance lever, if you're making the decision to design a new druid card, you'll be able to reference a pool of cards within the game, like dragons. And the size and variety of that pool is going to influence the power of the card you're designing. If the pool is small and the effects are varied, you know, offensive, defensive, supportive, win more, it's going to be a good card to fish for a Hail Mary play. And because the pool is small, it will be quite reliable in providing you access to that Hail Mary. Psychologically, of course, if you whiff on a card that's supposed to be reliable, it's going to feel bad. Especially since in a small pool with varied effects, you're likely to bump into the only one good outcome problem that we discussed previously. You know, if you don't get shown the one good defensive dragon, all the other dragons you might get shown are probably going to be starkly worse. Conversely, if you do hit, it's not going to be as monumental. That's an outcome to be expected. The opposite is going to be true when a huge pool is involved. Like, discover a druid, rogue, or shaman card. A rational player can't treat that as more than slight upside because the reliability is low and the difference between best possible and worst possible card in the pool in any given situation is huge. But hitting a pitch-perfect card on an effect like this is sure to be memorable, and even hitting 3 decent but not great ones is going to allow the player to showcase their decision-making skills. There's also the skill expression element, where a good player should be aware of what cards are available in the discover pools that they have access to. This is a memorization-based skill that can be trivialized by having access to a second monitor and the internet, at least in casual play. So I think in most Hearthstone players' internal skill models, you know, lists of skills they'd like to use and be rewarded for their use, this one is maybe low tier 2, high tier 3. I don't think it's anyone's favorite skill to showcase. But this form of skill expression has been noticed by Hearthstone designers, resulting in a couple of effects that are not as easily trivialized. Ones that appear on cards like Amalgam of the Deep, Grifta, or Resizing Pouch. They add a twist to the mechanic that emphasizes player decision-making. Now, on the player's side, players also have a number of means at their disposal to deal with randomness. The first is trivializing output randomness by the means of only having one specific output available, making it non-random essentially. There is a number of combo decks in Magic that make use of this, taking a random mechanic and making it non-random, but for this video let's look at Living End. It attempts to cheat into play its namesake card Living End, which switches the creatures on board and in graveyards. Hopefully beforehand you had the chance to fill yours with creatures. It tries to do so using an effect called Cascade. Whenever you play a card with Cascade, you go through the top cards of your deck looking for a card with a lower mana cost that you get to cast without paying for it. It's normally random because you don't know what's on top of your deck, but the only card that fits that criteria, that's a lower mana cost than the cards with Cascade in the deck, is Living End. So whenever you play a theoretically random output card, the outcome is always Living End. Now, that mechanic, Cascade, is not always used in that way. It occasionally found truly random output use in a deck now called Boomer John, but I remember it was just called John, so that probably says something about me. It featured a card called Bloodbraid Elf that got a bit power crept by now, but back then it was used and its randomness was accepted because Jund generally played high quality, generally useful cards. You could pull a dead removal spell when facing a creatureless deck, or maybe a Dark Confidant when at 2 health, which could very well kill you, but whenever you spun the roulette wheel on Bloodbraid, most of the returns would be something at least somewhat useful. There is a third method that you can also utilize when playing these random cards. The previous two were mostly about controlling the range of outcomes, limiting them to a single one or to a range of all acceptable ones, while this third one is mostly about controlling the odds. And that technique is to play random cards when the outcomes, the odds are favorable, and hold off on playing them when they're not. Let's come back to Gwent for a moment, as I am in the business of pretending Gwent is still alive. I'm holding an Uncrate Marauder in hand, and I'm faced with the decision of when within a round to play it, early or as opposed to late. If I want to maximize my chances of it damaging 3 different units because that activates a plethora of effects within my deck, I can play it when more units are present on the opponent's side of the board. While if I wanted for some reason for 2 or more of that damage to go to a single unit, maybe playing it early on is more beneficial. I will not have direct influence on where that damage will go on the final outcome, but I can take sequencing decisions to influence the odds, playing a card when they're favorable and holding off on playing it when they're not. Sequencing takes over some of the burden of giving me, the player, interesting decisions in that context, which randomness occasionally might rob me of. Thanks a lot for watching. In the top comment you can find attached a Google Doc with a list of sources that I've used when preparing for this video. Some of them are directly referenced, some of them have been useful in making me crystallize my own thoughts on the matter, and some of them are kind of extra credit. If you enjoy my work, you know what YouTubers always ask for, so click one of these. Thanks a lot for joining me, and I hope to see you in the next one.